"She's a manipulative leech who's been stealing from us for years," my daughter-in-law shouted in court. I didn't flinch. I stood, pulled out a signed affidavit, and handed it to the judge. He went pale and said, "No one moves. Close the doors." But let me back up to how I got to this moment, sitting in that sterile courtroom with fluorescent lights humming overhead while my own family painted me as a criminal. 3 months earlier, I was Margaret Chen, 62 years old, recently retired from my accounting firm after 35 years of meticulous work. My husband Robert had passed away 18 months before, leaving me alone in our 4-bedroom house in Millfield. The grief was still raw, but I was managing. I had my routines, my garden, my weekly bridge games with the ladies from church. That's when my son David and his wife Sarah moved in to help me through my grief. At least that's what they told everyone. Sarah was all smiles and concerned touches on my arm whenever neighbors were around.
Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching.
"Poor Margaret is having such a hard time adjusting," she'd whisper to Mrs. Henderson next door. "We just couldn't leave her alone in this big house." The changes started small. Sarah suggested we update the outdated kitchen. "It would be therapeutic for you, Mom Chen," she said, with that sweet smile that never quite reached her eyes. Then came the living room furniture. "This old stuff is so depressing. Let's brighten things up." My antique dining set that Robert and I had saved for disappeared one weekend while I was visiting my sister. "We donated it," Sarah explained. "You seemed so sad whenever you looked at it." Each time I protested, David would take Sarah's side. "Mom, she's just trying to help. You've been stuck in the past since Dad died." My gentle son, who used to defend me against playground bullies, now stood silently while his wife dismantled our family history piece by piece. The financial questions began subtly. Sarah would comment on bills left on the kitchen counter. "Goodness, your property taxes are high, and this utility bill seems excessive." She'd shake her head with mock concern. "Maybe we should help you organize your finances better." When I mentioned that Robert had left me quite comfortable with his life insurance and retirement savings, Sarah's eyes lit up in a way that should have warned me. "How wonderful that you don't have to worry about money. But you know, at your age, it might be wise to have someone younger help manage things. All these investment accounts and paperwork can be so overwhelming." I should have trusted my instincts. As an accountant, I knew exactly what my finances looked like. But grief does strange things to your confidence. The loneliness after Robert's death had left me vulnerable, desperate for family connection. When Sarah offered to help with my bookkeeping, saying it would give us bonding time, I foolishly agreed. The first signs of real trouble came when I received a call from my bank about unusual activity on my savings account, large withdrawals I didn't remember making. When I questioned Sarah, she had explanations ready. "Oh, those were for the house repairs we discussed. The new water heater, remember? And the roof estimate." She'd show me invoices that looked official enough, though something felt off about them. My attempts to check my own accounts were met with gentle resistance. "Mom Chen, you gave me the passwords, remember? You said you trusted me to handle these things. Don't you trust me?" The hurt in her voice made me question my own memory. Maybe I was becoming forgetful. Maybe grief had affected my mind more than I realized. The isolation crept in gradually, too. My bridge partners stopped calling. When I asked why, Sarah mentioned she'd told them I wasn't feeling up to social activities. "I was protecting you from having to make excuses," she explained. My sister's weekly calls became less frequent after Sarah started answering my phone. "Margaret's resting," she'd tell callers. "She's been having some difficult days." The breaking point came 6 weeks ago when I discovered significant sums missing from my retirement account. Not the small amounts Sarah had been taking for household expenses, but $40,000 withdrawn in a single transaction. When I confronted her, the mask finally slipped. "You're becoming paranoid, Margaret," she said, her voice cold. "First you accuse me of stealing. Now you're imagining transactions that don't exist. Maybe it's time we had you evaluated by a professional." That's when I knew I was in serious trouble. Sarah wasn't just stealing my money. She was methodically building a case that I was mentally incompetent. The forgetful widow, overwhelmed by finances, making wild accusations against her devoted daughter-in-law. But Sarah made one crucial mistake. She underestimated the woman who'd built a successful accounting practice from nothing, who'd kept meticulous records her entire professional life. While she was busy gaslighting me and manipulating David, I was quietly gathering evidence. Late at night, when they thought I was sleeping, I documented every questionable transaction, every forged signature, every lie about where my money had gone. I contacted my former clients who were lawyers, discreetly asking about elder abuse cases. I even set up a hidden camera in my home office after cash started disappearing from the emergency fund I kept in my desk drawer. The footage I captured was damning. Sarah going through my files, photographing financial documents, even practicing my signature on scratch paper. She was planning something bigger than just petty theft. The court date arrived after Sarah and David petitioned for guardianship, claiming I was no longer capable of managing my affairs. They presented a compelling case, a grieving widow, increasingly paranoid and confused, making wild accusations against the family members trying to help her. Sarah's performance was Oscar-worthy. Tears streamed down her face as she described how heartbreaking it was to watch me deteriorate. "She's accused me of stealing from her multiple times," she sobbed. "Yesterday, she claimed I'd taken $40,000 from her retirement account. The bank confirmed no such transaction occurred." Of course the bank confirmed it, because Sarah had opened a joint account and transferred the money legally, using the power of attorney I'd mistakenly granted her. David sat beside her, his face a mask of reluctant sadness, my own son, nodding along as his wife painted me as a delusional old woman whose mind had been destroyed by grief. The betrayal cut deeper than any financial loss. That's when I stood up in that courtroom, pulled out the signed affidavit, and watched the judge's face change. Because while Sarah had been busy playing victim, I'd been playing chess, and I was about to reveal my checkmate move. The judge's words echoed in the suddenly silent courtroom as he examined the affidavit I'd handed him. But to understand why that document was so powerful, you need to know how Sarah's manipulation began, and how close I came to losing everything without even realizing it. It started the day after Robert's funeral. I was sitting in my kitchen, still in my black dress, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The house felt impossibly empty, 38 years of marriage, and suddenly I was alone with nothing but the sound of the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. That's when David knocked on the door. My son looked so much like his father in that moment. The same concerned brown eyes, the same way of running his hand through his hair when he was worried. "Mom, Sarah and I have been talking. We don't think you should be alone right now." I should have been grateful. Maybe another mother would have been. But something felt off about the way Sarah stood behind him, her hand on his shoulder, her expression calculating rather than sympathetic. She'd never shown much interest in spending time with me before Robert died. At family gatherings, she'd make polite conversation for a few minutes before finding excuses to step away. "We could stay in the guest room," David continued, "just temporarily, until you're feeling stronger." I wanted to say no. Every instinct I'd developed over 6 decades of life was screaming that this was a mistake. But the loneliness was crushing, and David was my only child. "If you think it would help," I heard myself saying. Sarah's smile was radiant. "We'll take such good care of you, Mom Chen." The first week was almost normal. Sarah cooked meals, David helped with yard work, and we watched television together in the evenings. I started to think maybe I'd been unfair in my assessment of my daughter-in-law. Maybe grief had made me suspicious of kindness. Then came the suggestions. "Margaret, I noticed you have stacks of mail piling up on the kitchen counter. Would you like me to help you go through it?" Sarah's voice was gentle, concerned. "I know how overwhelming paperwork can be when you're grieving." I should have said no. But the truth was, I had been letting things pile up. Opening bills and bank statements felt like admitting Robert was really gone, that I was truly on my own now. "That would be helpful," I admitted. Sarah's efficiency was impressive. She sorted everything into neat piles, explaining each category as she worked. Bills to pay immediately, statements to file, junk mail to discard. She held up a credit card offer. "You get so many of these scam letters. It's good that you haven't been opening them. Seniors are targeted by these predators all the time." The word seniors stung. I was 62, not 90, but I let it pass. Over the following days, Sarah gradually took over more of my administrative tasks. "I'll handle the insurance paperwork for Robert's burial," she offered. "You shouldn't have to deal with such depressing details right now." When the life insurance check arrived, she brought it to me with a sympathetic expression. "Such a large amount must feel overwhelming. Would you like me to help you deposit it safely?" That's when the first red flag should have gone up. Sarah knew exactly how much the life insurance policy was worth, information I'd never shared with her. But grief makes you careless with details that would normally demand attention. The bank visit was my first real taste of Sarah's manipulation skills. She accompanied me, her arm linked through mine like a loving daughter. When we sat with the account manager, she did most of the talking. "My mother-in-law is having such a difficult time," she explained to the young man behind the desk. "She's been forgetting to pay bills, losing important documents. We're worried about her managing such a large sum on her own." She squeezed my hand. I've offered to help her stay organized. I wanted to protest. I wasn't forgetting bills or losing documents. But Sarah's tone was so caring, so reasonable, that contradicting her would have made me look defensive and confused. The bank manager nodded sympathetically and suggested adding Sarah as a joint account holder for convenience. "Just temporarily," Sarah assured me later. "Until you're feeling more like yourself." That night, I lay awake listening to Sarah and David's hushed conversation through the thin walls. I couldn't make out specific words, but Sarah's tone was excited, triumphant. David's responses sounded uncertain, questioning. I told myself I was being paranoid. Grief was making me imagine sinister motives where none existed. The changes to my house began slowly. Sarah would move things while cleaning, then apologize when I couldn't find them. "I'm so sorry, Mom Chen. I thought the sugar bowl looked better on this shelf." But it wasn't just displacement. Items were disappearing entirely. Small things at first. A silver picture frame that had held Robert's and my wedding photo. "I moved it somewhere safe while dusting," Sarah would say, then seemed genuinely puzzled when we couldn't locate it. My address book vanished from the kitchen drawer where I'd kept it for years. When I asked about it, Sarah looked concerned. "You asked me to throw it away yesterday, remember? You said all those old numbers were just making you sad." I had no memory of such a conversation, but Sarah's certainty made me doubt myself. The phone calls started changing too. Sarah began answering my line, screening my contacts with protective efficiency. "Margaret's having a difficult day," she'd tell my sister Linda. "Maybe try calling tomorrow?" When Linda did call back, Sarah would relay messages that never quite sounded like my sister's actual words. My bridge group was handled with particular skill. Sarah called each member personally to explain that I was taking a break from social activities while processing my grief. She suggested they give me space rather than reaching out directly. "Margaret feels guilty when she has to decline invitations," Sarah explained. "She's worried about disappointing people." Within a month, my social circle had shrunk to almost nothing. The women who'd been my friends for decades were suddenly absent from my life, and I was too embarrassed to explain that I hadn't actually asked for this isolation. The financial manipulation escalated gradually. Sarah would show me bills that seemed higher than usual, shaking her head with concern. "Your grocery expenses have really increased, and this utility bill seems excessive. Maybe there's a leak somewhere?" She'd pause meaningfully. "At your age, it's easy to miss these warning signs." Again with the age comments. I was a year younger than Sarah's own mother, but somehow I was being treated like I was sliding into senility. Sarah's suggestions became more frequent and more specific. "Maybe we should consolidate some of your accounts for easier management. That investment advisor of Robert's seems to be charging excessive fees. These monthly automatic payments are scattered across so many different bills. Let me help you streamline everything." Each change was presented as helpful simplification, protection against my supposedly declining mental faculties. And David supported every suggestion. His trust in his wife, absolute. The most insidious part was how Sarah made me complicit in my own victimization. She'd ask my permission for everything, making each decision seem like my choice. "Should I pay this bill for you, Mom Chen?" Would you like me to call the bank about this confusing statement? Don't you think it would be easier if I handled these transactions? I said yes because saying no would mean admitting I didn't trust her, and admitting I didn't trust her meant admitting that David had married someone who was systematically destroying my independence. 3 months into their stay, I realized I hadn't written a check or made a bank transaction in weeks. All my financial business was flowing through Sarah's helpful hands. My mail was sorted by her judgment. My social connections had been severed by her protective interventions. I was disappearing from my own life, one small concession at a time. But Sarah made one crucial error. She assumed that because I was grieving, I was also stupid. She forgot that I'd spent 35 years managing complex financial accounts, that I'd built my career on attention to detail and documentation. Late one night, unable to sleep, I went to my home office to find my financial records. What I discovered in my filing cabinet made my blood run cold. Statements I'd never seen before, showing withdrawals I'd never authorized, signature pages for accounts I didn't remember opening. That's when I realized this wasn't careless money management or grief-induced confusion. This was systematic theft, carefully planned and expertly executed, and that's when I started fighting back. The moment I saw those unauthorized withdrawals in my filing cabinet, something shifted inside me. The fog of grief that had been clouding my judgment for months suddenly lifted, replaced by the sharp clarity I'd relied on throughout my accounting career. I wasn't losing my mind. I was being robbed. My hands trembled as I spread the statements across my desk. $47,000 missing from various accounts over the past 3 months. Each withdrawal had been carefully orchestrated to avoid triggering bank alerts, amounts just under reporting thresholds, spread across different institutions, timed to coincide with periods when I'd been particularly distraught. The signatures looked like mine, but something was off about the pen pressure and letter formation. As someone who'd spent decades analyzing financial documents for inconsistencies, I recognized forgery when I saw it. Sarah had been practicing my handwriting, perfecting it over weeks of observation. But what chilled me most was the systematic nature of the theft. This wasn't opportunistic crime. It was a carefully planned operation. Sarah hadn't moved in to comfort a grieving widow. She'd moved in to position herself for a calculated heist. I needed evidence, but I had to be smart about gathering it. Sarah and David were just down the hall, and any suspicious behavior on my part could accelerate whatever timeline they were working toward. I quietly photographed each document with my phone, uploading them to a cloud storage account Sarah didn't know existed. The next morning, I acted as normally as possible. Sarah made breakfast while chattering about her plans to reorganize my closet. "You have so many clothes you never wear anymore, Mom Chen. We should donate them to make space for things that actually fit your current lifestyle." My current lifestyle. As if widowhood meant I needed an entirely new wardrobe to match my diminished circumstances. "That sounds lovely, dear," I said, forcing a smile while my mind raced. How many other assets was she planning to liquidate under the guise of helpful decluttering, while Sarah sorted through my belongings upstairs? I made a crucial phone call to my former colleague Janet Morrison, now a forensic accountant specializing in elder financial abuse. We'd worked together for 15 years before my retirement, and she knew my capabilities better than anyone. "Margaret, thank God you called," Janet said when I explained my situation. "I've been wondering about you since Robert's funeral. Sarah seemed so attentive at the service. Too attentive, if you know what I mean." I did know what she meant. Even in my grief-stricken state, I'd noticed how Sarah had positioned herself as my primary caretaker that day, intercepting condolence conversations and speaking for me when people asked how I was managing. "I need help documenting what's been happening," I told Janet. "But I can't let them know I'm investigating." Janet was quiet for a moment. "How long have they been living with you?" 3 months. "And you've given Sarah access to your accounts?" The shame burned in my throat. "Yes. She said it was temporary, just to help me stay organized." "Margaret, listen to me carefully. You're not the first intelligent woman to fall for this con. Grief makes people vulnerable, and these predators are experts at exploiting that vulnerability. The important thing now is building a case before they realize you're onto them. Janet walked me through the process of secretly documenting financial crimes. Hidden cameras were legal in my own home, especially if I suspected theft. Recording conversations was trickier, but if I could prove fraud, those recordings might become admissible evidence. Over the following weeks, I became a detective in my own house. I installed a tiny camera in my home office, concealed behind books on the shelf where I kept my financial files. I started carrying a small digital recorder, activated whenever Sarah brought up money matters. The footage I captured was damning. Sarah entered my office almost daily when she thought I was napping or out for errands. She photographed documents, practiced signatures, and even made phone calls to financial institutions claiming to be me. In one particularly disturbing recording, I heard her on the phone with my investment advisor. "This is Margaret Chen. I'm calling to discuss liquidating some assets. I've been having some memory issues lately, so my daughter-in-law Sarah is helping me manage things. Could you send the necessary paperwork to her attention?" My investment advisor, who'd known me for 20 years, apparently accepted this explanation without question. Within days, paperwork arrived for closing 2 of my smaller retirement accounts. But the most revealing evidence came from conversations between Sarah and David that I recorded from the kitchen while they talked in the living room. Their voices carried clearly through the old house's thin walls. "The probate lawyer says we need to be careful with the timeline," Sarah was saying. "If we move too fast on the guardianship petition, it might raise questions." "I still don't understand why we need guardianship at all," David replied. "Mom seems fine to me. Sad, but not incompetent." Sarah's laugh was cold. "She's been fine so far because I've been managing everything for her. But look at these bank statements. She's been making terrible financial decisions, withdrawing large amounts for no reason, forgetting about bills, signing documents she doesn't understand." My blood ran cold as I realized what she was doing. Sarah was creating evidence of my supposed incompetence by making the very mistakes she was attributing to me. The withdrawals she'd forged were being presented as proof of my declining mental state. "Once we have guardianship," Sarah continued, "we can move her into that assisted living facility we looked at. The house can be sold to pay for her care, and we can manage her remaining assets more efficiently." "Efficiently for whom?" David asked. And for a moment I heard a flicker of the moral sun I'd raised. "For her, of course," Sarah said smoothly. "And for us. We're sacrificing our own lives to care for her, David. We deserve some security for our future, too." That conversation clarified everything. Sarah wasn't just stealing my money. She was planning to steal my entire life. The assisted living facility would isolate me completely, making me dependent on her version of events. The house sale would provide a massive influx of cash, and guardianship would give her legal control over every aspect of my existence. I had to move fast. The next morning, I told Sarah I needed to visit my doctor for a routine checkup. "I'll drive you," she offered immediately, as she always did. But this time I was ready. "Actually, Linda is picking me up. We're having lunch afterward." It was a lie, but I needed to establish some independence. Sarah's smile tightened. "Are you sure that's wise? You know how Linda upsets you with all her questions about your finances." Linda had never asked me about my finances, but this comment revealed how carefully Sarah had been monitoring and controlling my relationships. "I'll be fine," I said firmly. "It's just a few hours." Instead of going to the doctor, I drove straight to Janet's office. Together, we spent 3 hours organizing my evidence and developing a strategy. Janet examined every document, every recording, every photograph with the methodical precision that had made her reputation in forensic accounting. "This is one of the most sophisticated elder abuse cases I've seen," she told me. "Sarah's been building this con for months, possibly planning it before Robert even died. She's created a paper trail that makes you look incompetent while positioning herself as the devoted caretaker. If she'd succeeded with the guardianship petition, you would have lost everything." Janet helped me contact a lawyer specializing in elder law and financial crimes. We scheduled an emergency consultation for the following week, right before the guardianship hearing that Sarah had arranged without my knowledge. But first, we needed to secure my remaining assets. Janet walked me through the process of freezing accounts, documenting the theft, and protecting what Sarah hadn't already stolen. The most important thing, Janet emphasized, is not to let them know you're fighting back. If Sarah realizes you've discovered her scheme, she might accelerate her timeline or destroy evidence. I drove home that afternoon with a strange mixture of terror and determination. For months, I'd been disappearing from my own life, allowing Sarah to erase my independence piece by piece. But now I was fighting back with all the skills and intelligence that had built my career. Sarah was waiting when I walked through the door, her expression carefully concerned. "How was your appointment? Mom Chen? You look tired." "Just the usual checkup," I replied, amazed at how normal my voice sounded. "Dr. Peterson says I'm doing well, considering everything." That night, I lay in bed listening to Sarah and David's whispered conversation through the walls. They were discussing the upcoming guardianship hearing, confident in their carefully constructed case. They had no idea that I was building a case of my own. And in just a few days, we would face each other in court, where the truth would finally come to light. The week before the guardianship hearing was the longest of my life. Every interaction with Sarah and David felt like walking through a minefield, knowing that one wrong step could expose my investigation and destroy any chance of justice. Sarah's behavior became increasingly possessive as the court date approached. She accompanied me everywhere, citing concerns about my episodes of confusion. When I tried to go grocery shopping alone, she insisted on driving. "You've been so forgetful lately, Mom Chen. Last week you couldn't remember where you parked the car." That had never happened, but Sarah's confident assertion made me doubt my own memory for a moment. That's the insidious nature of gaslighting. It makes you question your own reality even when you know you're being manipulated. The most disturbing incident occurred 3 days before the hearing. I was in my office, reviewing the evidence Janet and I had compiled, when Sarah walked in without knocking. "What are you working on?" she asked, her tone light, but her eyes sharp. I quickly minimized the browser window containing my financial records. "Just looking at some old photos of Robert," I said, clicking to a folder of pictures I kept on the desktop. Sarah moved closer, studying my computer screen. "You know, Mom Chen, spending so much time dwelling on the past isn't healthy. Maybe we should pack away some of these reminders until you're feeling stronger." The threat was subtle but clear. She was planning to remove even my memories of Robert, isolating me completely from everything that gave my life meaning. That evening, I overheard another conversation between Sarah and David that chilled me to the bone. "The lawyer says the hearing should be straightforward," Sarah was saying. "We have documented evidence of her declining mental state, witnesses who can testify to her confusion, and her own financial records showing poor judgment." "What witnesses?" David asked. "Mrs. Henderson from next door saw her wandering around the yard in her nightgown last Tuesday. And your mother's bridge friends are concerned about her decision to suddenly stop participating in social activities." My hands clenched into fists. I had never wandered around in my nightgown. Sarah had made that up entirely. And she was the one who'd isolated me from my bridge group by telling them I needed space. "The key," Sarah continued, "is presenting this as a loving family trying to protect a vulnerable woman from her own poor decisions. The judge will see that we're acting in her best interests." David was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes I wonder if we're doing the right thing. Mom built a successful business. She managed Dad's medical care for months before he died. It seems strange that she'd suddenly become incompetent." My heart lifted slightly. Maybe my son still had some capacity for independent thought, but Sarah was ready for his doubts. "Grief affects people differently, David, and she's not the same sharp woman she used to be. Look at how she's been handling money. Random withdrawals, forgotten bills, signing documents without reading them. These are classic signs of cognitive decline." She was describing her own actions while attributing them to me. The audacity was breathtaking. "Once we have guardianship," Sarah continued, "we can make sure she gets the care she needs. The assisted living facility has excellent programs for people with early-stage dementia." Dementia. She was planning to have me diagnosed with dementia based on financial irregularities she'd created herself. I had to bite my pillow to keep from screaming. The next morning brought a new crisis. Sarah announced that she'd scheduled a mental health evaluation for me with a geriatric psychiatrist. "It's just a formality for the guardianship hearing," she explained, her voice dripping with false concern. "Dr. Brennan specializes in age-related cognitive changes. He'll be able to confirm what we already know, that you need additional support managing your affairs." I realized this was Sarah's insurance policy. If the financial evidence wasn't enough to convince the judge, she'd have a medical professional testify that I was mentally incompetent. But I also realized this might be my opportunity. "That sounds reasonable," I said, surprising her with my cooperation. "I want to make sure I'm thinking clearly, too." Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly, but she couldn't object to my agreeing with her suggestion. Dr. Brennan's office was exactly what I'd expected: sterile, institutional, designed to make elderly patients feel diminished and vulnerable. But Dr. Brennan himself surprised me. He was younger than I'd anticipated, with intelligent eyes and a gentle manner that seemed genuinely concerned rather than condescending. Sarah had requested to sit in on the evaluation, citing her role as my caretaker. Dr. Brennan politely but firmly declined. "I need to speak with Mrs. Chen privately to get an accurate assessment." For the first time in months, I was alone with a professional who wasn't being influenced by Sarah's narrative. The evaluation began with standard cognitive tests: memory exercises, problem-solving tasks, orientation questions. I performed well on all of them, and I could see Dr. Brennan making notes that didn't support a dementia diagnosis. Then he asked about my living situation and recent changes in my life. "My daughter-in-law has been very helpful since my husband died," I said carefully. "She's taken over most of my financial management. How do you feel about that arrangement?" It was the first time in months that anyone had asked how I felt about what was happening to me. The question nearly broke my composure. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm becoming too dependent on her help," I admitted. "I used to be very capable with money. I ran my own accounting firm for 35 years. Dr. Brennan looked up from his notes. "What kind of accounting work did you do?" I described my career, my expertise, my reputation in the business community. Dr. Brennan listened intently, occasionally asking follow-up questions that demonstrated he understood the complexity of the work I'd done. "Mrs. Chen," he said finally, "based on our conversation today, I see no evidence of cognitive impairment that would prevent you from managing your own affairs. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning skills are intact, and your judgment appears sound." Relief flooded through me. "What about the financial issues my daughter-in-law mentioned?" Dr. Brennan frowned. "What specific issues?" I described the concerns Sarah had raised: forgotten bills, impulsive withdrawals, poor financial decisions. Dr. Brennan made more notes. "Have you actually been experiencing these problems, or have others told you that you're experiencing them?" The question hit like a lightning bolt. "Others have told me," I realized. "I don't remember making the mistakes they've described." Dr. Brennan nodded slowly. "Mrs. Chen, I'm going to ask you a difficult question, and I want you to think carefully before answering. Do you feel safe in your current living situation?" The question hung in the air between us. This was my chance to tell the truth, to ask for help from someone with the authority to intervene, but I also knew that any accusations I made would be dismissed as paranoid delusions if I couldn't prove them. "I'm not sure," I said honestly. "I think I need to investigate some concerns before I can answer that question properly." Dr. Brennan studied my face for a long moment. "If you ever feel unsafe or need someone to talk to confidentially, here's my direct number." He handed me a card. Sometimes family members have the best intentions but don't realize they're being overprotective in ways that harm their loved one's independence. When the evaluation ended, Sarah was waiting in the reception area with barely concealed anxiety. "How did it go?" she asked brightly. "Dr. Brennan was very thorough," I said neutrally. On the drive home, Sarah probed for details about the evaluation. I gave vague responses while my mind raced with possibilities. Dr. Brennan's assessment would undermine Sarah's case for guardianship, but I wasn't sure it would be enough to expose her financial crimes. That evening, I made a decision that would change everything. I called Janet and asked her to contact Dr. Brennan's office. "I want him to know about the financial irregularities," I told her. If Sarah tries to use a psychiatric evaluation to support her guardianship petition, he needs to understand the full context. Janet was quiet for a moment. Margaret, that's risky. If Dr. Brennan reports suspected elder abuse, it could trigger an investigation before we're ready. I think we have to take that risk, I said. Sarah's timeline is accelerating. If we wait much longer, she might succeed in having me declared incompetent before we can prove she's the one committing crimes. The next day, Janet met with Dr. Brennan and shared our evidence. His response was immediate and decisive. He would not only refuse to support the guardianship petition, but would testify about signs of psychological manipulation if necessary. But Sarah had one more card to play. 2 days before the hearing, she presented me with documents to sign. "Just some insurance paperwork," she said casually. "The company needs updated beneficiary information." I glanced at the papers, and my blood ran cold. They weren't insurance forms. They were financial powers of attorney that would give Sarah complete control over my remaining assets. "I'll look these over later," I said, setting them aside. Sarah's mask slipped for just a moment. "They need to be returned tomorrow, Mom Chen. It's time-sensitive." That night, I realized Sarah was panicking. Dr. Brennan's evaluation hadn't gone as she'd planned, and she was trying to secure legal control over my finances before the guardianship hearing could potentially go against her. I was running out of time, but I finally had all the evidence I needed. The confrontation was coming, and I was ready. The night before the guardianship hearing, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed listening to the familiar sounds of the house Robert and I had shared for decades, the settling of old wood, the whisper of wind through the maple tree outside our bedroom window, the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen where I'd prepared thousands of meals for my family. By morning, this might all be taken away from me. Sarah had left the power of attorney documents on my kitchen table with a note. "Please sign these before we leave for court, Mom Chen. The insurance company needs them today." Even now, she was maintaining the fiction that these were routine paperwork, rather than the final step in her elaborate theft. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing the navy blue suit I'd worn to important business meetings during my accounting career. If this was going to be my last stand, I wanted to look like the competent professional I'd always been, not the confused widow Sarah had spent months creating. At breakfast, David seemed nervous, fidgeting with his coffee cup and avoiding eye contact. Sarah, by contrast, was almost radiant with confidence. She'd styled her hair perfectly and chosen a modest dress that projected maternal concern and respectability. "Are you ready for today, Mom Chen?" she asked, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I know this is difficult, but we're doing what's best for you." "I understand," I said quietly, and I did understand. Perhaps better than she realized. We drove to the courthouse in Sarah's car, with me relegated to the back seat like a child being transported by her caretakers. Sarah kept up a steady stream of reassuring chatter about how the proceedings would be quick and painless. How I'd be so much happier once I didn't have to worry about managing my affairs anymore. The courthouse was intimidating, all marble columns and echoing hallways that made me feel small and vulnerable. Exactly the effect Sarah was counting on, I realized. She'd chosen this venue deliberately to emphasize my supposed fragility. Our lawyer, Mr. Patterson, met us in the hallway outside the courtroom. He was younger than I'd expected, with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from winning cases rather than seeking justice. Sarah had chosen him carefully. "Mrs. Chen," he said, shaking my hand with practiced sympathy, "I want you to know that we're here to protect your interests. The guardianship arrangement we're proposing will ensure that you receive the care and support you need." He spoke about me as if I weren't standing right there, using the third-person tone that medical professionals often adopted with elderly patients. I was already being treated as incompetent before the hearing had even begun. Inside the courtroom, I was shocked to see several familiar faces in the gallery. Mrs. Henderson from next door, my former bridge partner Carol, even my mailman Mr. Rodriguez. Sarah had assembled an impressive array of witnesses, all prepared to testify about my supposed decline. But I noticed someone else in the courtroom who made my heart lift slightly. Janet Morrison, sitting quietly in the back row. She caught my eye and gave me an almost imperceptible nod. My allies were in position too. Judge Harrison was a stern-looking woman in her 50s who commanded immediate respect. She reviewed the paperwork briefly before addressing the courtroom. We're here today to consider a petition for guardianship of Margaret Chen, filed by her son David Chen and daughter-in-law Sarah Chen. The petitioners claim that Mrs. Chen is no longer capable of managing her financial and personal affairs due to cognitive decline related to grief and advancing age. The words hit me like physical blows. Cognitive decline. Advancing age. They were reducing my entire life to a medical condition that required management by others. Mr. Patterson rose to present their case, and his opening statement was masterful in its manipulation of facts. Your Honor, Margaret Chen was once a successful businesswoman, but the death of her husband 18 months ago has taken a severe toll on her mental faculties. Since that time, she has made increasingly irrational financial decisions, forgotten to pay important bills, and shown signs of paranoia toward the very family members who are trying to help her. He presented a timeline of my supposed decline that was frighteningly convincing because it contained just enough truth to be believable. Yes, I had been grieving. Yes, I had allowed Sarah to help with my finances. Yes, there had been irregularities in my accounts. What he didn't mention was who had actually caused those irregularities. The witnesses Sarah had assembled painted a picture of a confused, isolated woman who was clearly beyond caring for herself. Mrs. Henderson testified about seeing me wandering aimlessly in my yard at odd hours. Carol described how I'd abruptly stopped participating in our bridge games without explanation. Mr. Rodriguez mentioned that my mail had been piling up uncollected for weeks at a time. Each testimony was technically accurate, but stripped of crucial context. I had been in my yard at unusual hours because I couldn't sleep, a normal response to grief. I'd stopped playing bridge because Sarah had told my friends I needed space. My mail had been piling up because Sarah had been collecting it before I could get to it. But in the antiseptic environment of the courtroom, these normal responses to loss and manipulation were being reframed as evidence of mental incompetence. The most damaging testimony came from Sarah herself. She took the witness stand with perfect composure, her voice breaking at just the right moments as she described the heartbreak of watching her beloved mother-in-law deteriorate. I've tried so hard to help her maintain her independence, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. But the financial mistakes have become more frequent and more serious. Last month alone, she withdrew nearly $15,000 from her savings account and couldn't explain where the money had gone. I wanted to scream that Sarah had made those withdrawals herself, using forged signatures and stolen account information. But my lawyer, the public defender who'd been assigned to represent my interests, seemed more interested in negotiating the terms of my guardianship than in challenging the evidence against me. Mrs. Chen, Judge Harrison said, addressing me directly for the first time. Do you understand the nature of these proceedings? I stood carefully, my legs unsteady from the stress of the morning. Yes, Your Honor. My family believes I'm no longer capable of managing my own affairs. How do you feel about that assessment? This was my moment. I could accept the narrative that had been constructed around me, allow myself to be declared incompetent, and spend my remaining years as a ward of the people who had systematically robbed me. Or I could fight back with everything I had. Your Honor, I said, my voice gaining strength. I believe there are some serious misunderstandings about my situation that need to be addressed. Sarah's confident expression flickered for just a moment. Mr. Patterson half rose from his seat, clearly preparing to object to whatever I might say. But I wasn't finished. I'd like to present some evidence that I believe is relevant to these proceedings. Judge Harrison looked surprised. What kind of evidence? Mrs. Chen, I reached into my purse and pulled out a manila envelope, financial records, recordings, and documentation that I believe will shed new light on the circumstances that brought us here today. Sarah had gone completely pale. David looked confused and frightened. Mr. Patterson was on his feet now, objecting loudly about proper procedures and evidence submission. But Judge Harrison held up her hand for silence. Mrs. Chen, did you compile this evidence yourself? Yes, Your Honor. With the assistance of a forensic accountant and my former business colleagues. The judge's expression sharpened with interest. Approach the bench. Please. As I walked forward with my envelope, I could hear Sarah whispering urgently to Mr. Patterson behind me. David was trying to get their attention, clearly realizing that something had gone very wrong with their carefully orchestrated plan. I handed the envelope to Judge Harrison, who examined its contents with growing amazement. Financial records showing Sarah's systematic theft, audio recordings of her discussing the guardianship plan as a way to gain control of my assets, photographs from the hidden camera showing her forging my signature and accessing my accounts without permission. Most damning of all was Dr. Brennan's psychological evaluation, which not only confirmed my mental competence, but also documented clear signs that I had been the victim of financial and psychological abuse. Judge Harrison looked up from the documents, her expression transformed from judicial neutrality to barely controlled anger. "Mrs. Chen," she said quietly, "are you alleging that the financial irregularities cited in this guardianship petition were not the result of your own actions?" "That's correct, Your Honor. I believe they were the result of systematic theft and forgery committed by my daughter-in-law, Sarah Chen, over the past several months." The courtroom erupted. Sarah was on her feet, shouting about lies and manipulation. Mr. Patterson was demanding that my evidence be excluded. David was staring at his wife with dawning horror as the full scope of her deception became clear. But Judge Harrison's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "No one moves. Close the doors." And in that moment, I knew that justice was finally within reach. The silence in the courtroom was deafening after Judge Harrison's words. I watched Sarah's face cycle through disbelief, rage, and finally a cold calculation that chilled me to the bone. Even in handcuffs, she was still looking for angles, still trying to manipulate the situation. "Your Honor," Mr. Patterson said, his voice strained, "my client maintains her innocence. These allegations are based on circumstantial evidence and the confused perceptions of an elderly woman who—" "Mr. Patterson," Judge Harrison interrupted sharply, "I suggest you stop talking immediately. Your client is facing serious criminal charges, and anything you say right now could make her situation considerably worse." Detective Martinez stepped forward with Assistant District Attorney Wells. They'd been waiting in the hallway since Judge Harrison had called for law enforcement, and their presence transformed the atmosphere completely. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a criminal investigation. "Mrs. Sarah Chen," Detective Martinez said formally, "you're under arrest for elder financial abuse, forgery, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Sarah's scream echoed through the courtroom as the handcuffs clicked into place. "This is insane. David, tell them. Tell them how confused she's been, how she's been making things up." But David wasn't looking at his wife anymore. He was staring at me with an expression of horror and dawning understanding. My son, my gentle, trusting son, was finally seeing the woman he'd married for what she really was. "Mom," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Oh God, Mom, what did we do to you?" The pain in his voice almost undid me. David wasn't a willing participant in Sarah's scheme. He was another victim, manipulated as skillfully as I had been. Sarah had used his love for both of us to blind him to her crimes. As Sarah was led away, still protesting her innocence and making wild accusations, Judge Harrison addressed the remaining people in the courtroom. "The petition for guardianship is not only denied, it's dismissed with prejudice. Mrs. Margaret Chen has demonstrated exceptional mental competence and remarkable courage in documenting what appears to be a sophisticated criminal conspiracy against her." She turned to look at me directly. "Mrs. Chen, I want you to know that elder abuse is one of the most underreported crimes in our society. Victims are often convinced they're experiencing natural confusion rather than deliberate manipulation. Your decision to fight back may have saved not only your own independence, but protected other potential victims from this predator." The words felt like absolution after months of being told I was paranoid, confused, and incompetent. After the hearing, David and I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot. He was crying, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere primal. "I helped her," he kept saying. "I helped her isolate you. I helped her make you feel crazy. How could I not see what she was doing?" I reached over and took his hand, the same hand I'd held when he was a frightened little boy. "She's very good at what she does, David. The detective told me they found evidence of 2 other elderly women she'd targeted in neighboring towns. This wasn't impulse. It was a pattern. But you're my mother. I should have protected you." The guilt in his voice was almost unbearable. "You thought you were protecting me. She convinced you I needed protecting from myself." We sat in silence for a while, watching people come and go from the courthouse. Normal people dealing with normal legal matters, divorces, traffic tickets, property disputes, nothing like the nightmare we'd been living through. "What happens now?" David asked finally. "Now we figure out how to rebuild," I said. Both of us. The investigation moved quickly. Within a week, Detective Martinez had traced the full extent of Sarah's theft. She'd stolen $63,000 from my various accounts over 6 months, using forged signatures and stolen account information. The money had gone toward credit card payments, a new car, and a down payment on a vacation home she'd been planning to surprise David with after she'd gained control of all my assets. The vacation home purchase was what ultimately sealed her fate. She'd used my forged signature to secure a loan, creating a paper trail that was impossible to explain away. But more disturbing than the money was the psychological evidence. Investigators found detailed notes in Sarah's handwriting, documenting her strategy for isolating me from friends and family. She'd kept a journal of my daily activities, looking for signs of confusion she could exploit. She'd even researched the symptoms of early-stage dementia to better mimic them in her reports to David and others. It was systematic, calculated, and utterly without conscience. The trial 8 months later was swift and decisive. Sarah's new lawyer, Mr. Patterson, had withdrawn from the case, tried to argue that she'd genuinely believed I was incompetent and had been trying to help. But the evidence was overwhelming. The audio recordings were particularly damaging. Hearing Sarah's voice as she discussed plans to sell my house and move me to assisted living made it clear that she'd never been concerned with my welfare. She'd been planning my elimination from my own life. She was sentenced to 6 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution. The judge noted that elder abuse was a particularly heinous crime because it targeted society's most vulnerable members and destroyed the trust that families depend on. During the months leading up to the trial, David and I slowly began rebuilding our relationship. It wasn't easy. Trust, once shattered so completely, doesn't heal quickly, but we both committed to the work of repairing what Sarah had broken. David started visiting regularly, not to check on my competence, but to simply spend time with his mother. We talked about Robert, about David's childhood, about the dreams and disappointments that make up a life. For the first time in years, we had conversations that weren't filtered through Sarah's manipulation. He helped me reconnect with friends I'd lost during Sarah's isolation campaign. My bridge group welcomed me back with tears and fierce hugs. My neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, apologized for believing Sarah's lies about my supposed decline. Even my mailman, Mr. Rodriguez, mentioned how glad he was to see me looking like myself again. 6 months after the trial, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I came out of retirement. Using my settlement money and my accounting expertise, I started a small consulting practice focused on financial protection for seniors. I partnered with Janet Morrison to offer services ranging from basic financial reviews to complex forensic accounting for suspected elder abuse cases. The work was deeply satisfying. Every senior citizen I helped protect from financial predators felt like a victory against the kind of evil that had almost destroyed my own life. I spoke at community centers about warning signs of elder abuse. I worked with local law enforcement to help them recognize financial manipulation tactics. Most importantly, I helped other victims understand that being targeted didn't mean they were weak or foolish. It meant they'd encountered a predator, and predators are skilled at what they do. A year after Sarah's conviction, I received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Brennan, the psychiatrist who'd evaluated me. "Mrs. Chen," he said, "I wanted you to know that your case has become a teaching example in our professional training programs. The way you documented your own abuse while maintaining your psychological equilibrium under extreme stress is remarkable." "I don't feel remarkable," I told him. "I feel like I barely survived." "That's exactly what makes it remarkable," he replied. "You didn't just survive, you fought back intelligently and systematically. You turned your professional skills into weapons for self-defense. That takes extraordinary strength." As I hung up the phone, I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, grieving, lonely, desperate for family connection. That woman had been vulnerable to Sarah's manipulation precisely because her losses had left her emotionally isolated. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I had learned that vulnerability doesn't equal weakness, and that asking for help doesn't mean surrendering control. I'd discovered that true strength comes not from avoiding difficult situations, but from fighting back when those situations become intolerable. Most importantly, I'd proven to myself that intelligence, competence, and dignity don't diminish with age. They're simply tools that require greater skill and courage to wield as the stakes get higher. Sarah had tried to steal more than my money. She'd tried to steal my identity, my relationships, my independence, and my future. In her twisted logic, I was nothing more than a convenient source of funds to support her lifestyle. But she'd made a crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that because I was grieving, I was also stupid. She'd forgotten that the woman she was targeting had built a successful business from nothing, had navigated complex financial systems for decades, and had the intelligence and determination to fight back when cornered. On quiet evenings, I sometimes wondered what would have happened if I hadn't found those bank statements that night. Would I be sitting in some sterile assisted living facility right now, convinced I was suffering from dementia while Sarah enjoyed my life savings? The thought still made me shudder, but it also filled me with gratitude for the instincts that had saved me, for the friends who'd supported me, and for the son who'd found his way back to me despite everything. Sarah had tried to reduce me to a helpless victim, but she'd accidentally forged me into something much more dangerous, a survivor who was determined to protect others from experiencing what I'd endured. I was Margaret Chen, 63 years old, and I was nobody's victim anymore.